My husband missed our son's birth because of a work emergency. His coworker posted pictures of their team building retreat that same day. I stared at those photos while holding our newborn, still shaking from 18 hours of labor. Golf courses, wine tasting, group photos with everyone grinning. And there was Brandon, right in the center, holding up a glass. When he finally walked into the hospital room 6 hours after delivery, he was sunburned. His shoes were caked with grass clippings and he smelled like a country club. I didn't say anything, just handed him our son and watched him fumble with the blanket. He asked what I'd named him. I'd texted 3 times during labor with name options. He hadn't responded to any of them. Harrison, I said, after my grandfather. He nodded like he'd been part of that decision. The nurses kept glancing at me with pity. That night, Brandon fell asleep in the chair within minutes while I tried to figure out breastfeeding alone. A nurse named Patricia adjusted Harrison's latch without being asked. The lies started small after that. Working late became his default excuse. Missing Harrison's first bath, his pediatrician appointment, the newborn photos I'd booked. I kept track without meaning to. 14 date nights canceled. 9 family dinners he walked out of. 21 times he promised to be home by 6 and showed up after Harrison was asleep. I started checking his coworkers' social media obsessively. The quarterly review meeting that ran until 9, they'd been at a bar, the emergency presentation, bowling league finals. When Harrison turned 6 months old, I confronted Brandon with screenshots spread across our kitchen table. He barely glanced at them before laughing, asking if I was jealous of his work friends. I reminded him he'd lied about our son's birth. He slammed his hand on the table, making Harrison cry, then told me he chose his career, which paid for everything. Maybe if I contributed financially, I'd understand professional obligations. I'd been a marketing director before getting pregnant. Brandon convinced me Harrison needed me home. Now he was using my sacrifice as ammunition. Through the door, I heard his car peeling out at 10:30 on a Tuesday. 2 weeks later, I saw it. Brandon's coworker had posted an album titled Weekend Getaway Crew, 38 photos of a lake house trip. The same weekend he'd told me he was at mandatory corporate training in Dallas. There was Brandon with his arm around a woman I'd never seen before, her hand on his chest. I screenshot everything before the account went private. Then I opened our credit card statements, charges I didn't recognize, restaurants in cities he'd never mentioned, a hotel room in Milwaukee on Valentine's Day, the same night he'd claimed to be visiting his sick mother in Phoenix. I called her. She answered healthy as ever, confused why I was asking about February. I started digging. Bank statements, phone records, cloud storage, text messages going back 8 months with 3 different numbers, plans coordinated around his lies to me, photos he'd never shown me, a whole life I knew nothing about. I sat on our bedroom floor surrounded by printed evidence. Harrison sleeping peacefully. Brandon came home that night whistling, carrying takeout. He found me at the kitchen table and froze when he saw the papers. The bank statements highlighted in yellow. For the first time since I'd known him, Brandon had nothing to say. I watched him try to formulate an excuse. He couldn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his keys and walked out. He didn't come back that night, or the next. On day 3, I got a text saying he needed space to think. That's when I opened his laptop and found the folder labeled Tax Documents 2024. Inside were airline confirmations, hotel receipts, and photos of Brandon with the same woman from the lake house. Except in these photos, she was wearing a ring. Their wedding album from 6 months ago. The wedding had happened in Costa Rica. Small ceremony, beachside. The date was March 15th. I'd been 8 months pregnant, on bed rest because of high blood pressure. Brandon had told me he was attending a sales conference in Atlanta. I remembered that week clearly because I'd spent it alone, terrified I might go into early labor with no one there to drive me to the hospital. My mom had offered to stay with me, but Brandon insisted she'd be too overbearing. He'd call me every night around 10, always rushed, always claiming the networking events ran late. In these photos, he wore a linen suit. The woman, whose name appeared tagged in several images as Melissa, wore a white dress. They were holding hands, kissing under an arch of tropical flowers, cutting a cake. His parents were there, his sister, people I'd met at our own wedding 5 years earlier, smiling and raising champagne glasses to celebrate his second marriage. Our marriage was still legally binding. He'd never filed for divorce, never even mentioned wanting one. I sat there until Harrison started crying for his morning feeding. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the bottle. Every assumption I'd built my life on had just shattered. Who was this man? Had he ever actually loved me? Or had I always been the placeholder, the convenient wife while he built something else with someone else entirely? I called a divorce attorney that morning. Her name was Francine and she'd been recommended by a college friend who'd gone through an ugly separation. She could see me that afternoon. I packed Harrison into his car seat and drove 40 minutes to her office in silence, my brain unable to process anything except the immediate next steps. Francine was in her 50s with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp eyes that had seen every variation of human betrayal. I showed her everything. The photos, the credit card statements, the text messages I'd recovered from his cloud backup. She took notes without visible reaction, though her jaw tightened when I got to the wedding album. "This is bigamy," she said flatly. "That's a felony. He could face up to 5 years in prison depending on the state. More importantly for you, this invalidates his second marriage entirely. Everything he's purchased with her, any property they've acquired together, you have a claim to as his legal spouse." I hadn't even thought that far ahead. I was still stuck on the fundamental wrongness of it all. He'd married another woman while married to me, while I was pregnant with his child. What kind of person does that? Francine started pulling up records. Within an hour, she'd found the house. Brandon and Melissa had purchased a home together in Austin 4 months ago, a 4-bedroom colonial with a pool bought for $680,000. The down payment came from our joint savings account, money I'd contributed to from my years working, money we'd supposedly been saving for Harrison's college fund. He'd drained $85,000 without my knowledge or signature, forging my name on the withdrawal authorization. There was more. A joint checking account with Melissa, funded by automatic transfers from his work paychecks. A car lease in both their names. Insurance policies listing her as his beneficiary. He'd built an entire financial infrastructure around this second life, systematically stealing from our marriage to fund it. Francine made several calls while I sat there feeling numb. By the time I left her office 2 hours later, she'd frozen all our joint accounts, filed for emergency sole custody of Harrison, and begun the process of pressing criminal charges for bigamy and fraud. She estimated I'd need about $15,000 upfront for legal fees. I had $3,200 in my personal account, money I'd saved from birthday gifts and the small freelance projects I'd been doing from home. I drove to my parents' house. Mom answered the door and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. I haven't cried in front of my mother since I was 12. That day I sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe. Harrison pressed against my chest, while she held us both and didn't ask questions until I was ready. When I finally told her, Dad's face went through several shades of red before settling on a kind of cold fury I'd never seen from him before. He's always been mild-mannered, the type to avoid conflict and see the best in people. He called Brandon's phone right there in the kitchen and left a voicemail that I won't repeat, but it involved detailed descriptions of what he'd do if Brandon came near me or Harrison again. They gave me the money that night. My dad wrote a check for $15,000 without hesitation. "Your grandmother left this for emergencies," he said. "This qualifies." They set up the guest room for Harrison and me. I moved in the next day with 3 suitcases and a diaper bag, everything else still at the house I'd shared with Brandon. Brandon didn't respond to the legal papers for 6 days. When he finally did, it was through his own attorney, a man named Roger who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. The response claimed I'd misunderstood the situation, that the wedding photos were from a themed corporate event, that Melissa was merely a colleague and friend. It was so blatantly false that Francine actually laughed when she read it. "They're going to argue the photos are fake," she said, "or taken out of context. It's a standard play when they have no real defense. We'll depose everyone who attended that wedding, his parents, his sister, the officiant. They'll all testify under oath about what happened, and Brandon will be forced to either admit to perjury or admit to bigamy." The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In that time, Brandon tried calling me 62 times. I never answered. He showed up at my parents' house twice. The first time, Dad met him at the door and told him to leave or he'd call the police. The second time, Brandon waited until he saw me leaving with Harrison for a pediatrician appointment. He stepped out of his car and blocked my path. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "You're blowing this completely out of proportion." I stared at him. At this man I'd loved, or thought I'd loved, who'd somehow become a complete stranger. "How do you blow bigamy out of proportion?" I asked. "It's not what you think. Melissa and I, it's complicated. We were going to tell you." "When? After Harrison's first birthday? His graduation?" "Never." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. "I made mistakes, okay? But you can't just take my son away from me. That's not fair." Something in me snapped. "Fair? You missed his birth to go golfing with your coworkers? You've spent maybe 20 total hours with him in 6 months. You married another woman while I was pregnant, and you're talking to me about fair?" People were starting to stare. We were standing in the parking lot of a pediatric clinic, both of us raising our voices. Brandon noticed and lowered his tone, stepping closer. "Look, I'll admit I messed up. I'll go to counseling. We can fix this." I stepped back. "You committed a felony, Brandon. Multiple felonies. There's no fixing that." I walked past him into the clinic. He didn't follow. When I came out 30 minutes later, his car was gone. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Melissa. "We need to meet. There are things you don't know about Brandon. Things I didn't know either until yesterday." I showed the text to Francine. She advised against meeting without legal representation present. So we arranged it for her office, neutral ground with witnesses. Melissa showed up looking exhausted. She was younger than me, maybe 26, with long dark hair and the kind of effortless beauty that made me understand why Brandon had been attracted to her. But there was something broken in her eyes, a recognition I'd seen in my own mirror. She sat across from me in Francine's conference room and started talking. She'd met Brandon 2 years ago at a work conference. He'd told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had full custody of their son, that he was trying to rebuild his life. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was charming, successful, seemed emotionally available. They'd dated for 8 months before he proposed. "I didn't know you existed until 3 days ago," she said quietly. "I found your pregnancy announcement on his old Facebook account. The dates don't add up with anything he told me, so I started looking through his things. Found the marriage certificate. Found photos of you two at your wedding. Found his wedding ring hidden in a box in the garage." Her voice cracked. I confronted him. He tried to lie at first, then broke down and admitted everything. Said he'd gotten in too deep with both relationships and didn't know how to get out. Like we're some kind of financial debt he mismanaged. Francine took notes. Melissa signed an affidavit right there. documenting everything Brandon had told her, every lie he'd constructed. It was damning, not just for the bigamy case, but for the custody fight. A man who could maintain two separate families, who could lie that extensively for that long, wasn't someone who should have unsupervised access to a child. After Melissa left, I sat in Francine's office trying to process it all. In a twisted way, I felt sorry for her. She'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had. She'd planned a future with a man who didn't exist. The hearing was brutal. Brandon showed up in a suit with Roger beside him, projecting confidence like this was just another business negotiation. But when the judge reviewed the evidence, his confidence evaporated quickly. Photos of the wedding, testimony from his sister who'd flown to Costa Rica for the ceremony, bank records showing the systematic theft of marital assets, text messages planning the wedding while I was on bed rest. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Constance, who'd clearly seen every variation of human awfulness in her 30 years on the bench. She listened to everything with a neutral expression, then turned to Brandon and asked him directly if he had anything to say in his defense. He stood up, started with an apology that sounded rehearsed, said he'd made terrible choices but loved Harrison and wanted to be in his son's life, said he was willing to make amends, attend therapy, do whatever it took to prove he could be a good father. Judge Constance cut him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "you committed bigamy. You fraudulently withdrew $85,000 from your marital accounts. You lied under oath in your initial response to these proceedings. I'm not interested in your promises about the future. I'm interested in your pattern of behavior." She awarded me full legal and physical custody of Harrison, ordered Brandon to pay child support of $2,400 per month, froze all remaining joint assets pending a full forensic accounting, and most significantly, she forwarded the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Brandon's face went white. Roger whispered something to him urgently, but the judge wasn't finished. She also granted a restraining order requiring Brandon to stay at least 500 feet from me, Harrison, and my parents' home. Any contact had to go through our attorneys. I walked out of that courtroom feeling something between relief and emptiness. I'd won, technically. But what had I actually won? The right to raise my son alone? The knowledge that I'd wasted 5 years of my life on someone who'd never actually loved me? A legal battle that would probably drag on for months or years. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. The district attorney was a woman named Valerie who'd built her career on prosecuting fraud and seemed personally offended by Brandon's actions. She subpoenaed everyone who'd attended the Costa Rica wedding, gathered testimony from hotel staff who remembered the event, obtained copies of the marriage license he'd applied for using false information, claiming to be single. Brandon tried to negotiate a plea deal. Valerie refused. She wanted this case to go to trial, wanted it on record that bigamy had consequences. The trial was set for 8 months out. In the meantime, Brandon's life imploded in slow motion. His company fired him once the criminal charges became public. Apparently having an employee awaiting trial for felony fraud was bad for business. Melissa filed her own lawsuit against him for fraud and emotional distress. His parents, who'd attended that beach wedding, now claimed they'd been lied to as well. Said Brandon had told them I'd agreed to a divorce, but we were keeping it quiet for Harrison's sake. I didn't believe them, but I also didn't have the energy to care. I focused on Harrison, on building routines and stability. He was too young to understand any of this, thank God. To him, life was bottles and naps and tummy time, Grandpa making funny faces, Grandma singing old lullabies. He didn't know his father had never really wanted him, had been too busy playing house in Austin to care about the family he'd created here. My old boss from the marketing firm called 6 weeks after the hearing. She'd seen the news coverage of the trial, put together that I was the same person who'd worked for her until last year. She offered me a position, remote work with flexible hours, managing social media campaigns for their smaller clients. The pay was modest, but it meant I could contribute financially again, start rebuilding my own independence. I took the job, started working during Harrison's naps and after he went to bed at night. It felt good to use my brain again for something other than analyzing my husband's betrayals or coordinating with attorneys. The projects were simple at first, but my boss gradually gave me more responsibility as I proved I could handle the workload alongside new motherhood. 3 months after the hearing, I moved out of my parents' house and into a small apartment across town. 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, but it was mine. No memories of Brandon contaminating every room. I furnished it slowly, piece by piece from thrift stores and clearance sales. Harrison's room got a crib painted ocean blue and a mobile with wooden boats that spun in the breeze from the window. Brandon's criminal trial started in November. I had to testify, which meant sitting 15 feet from him and recounting our entire relationship. The prosecutor walked me through everything: how we met, when we got engaged, our wedding, the pregnancy, Harrison's birth. Each detail felt like reopening a wound I'd been trying to let heal. Brandon's attorney tried to make me seem vindictive, suggested I'd known about Melissa all along and was only pressing charges out of spite after our marriage naturally deteriorated. But the evidence was too overwhelming. You can't argue with photos of a wedding that occurred while your client was legally married to someone else. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: bigamy, fraud, perjury. Judge Constance, who'd also presided over the criminal case, sentenced him to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. She also ordered him to pay restitution of $85,000 plus interest for the money he'd stolen. I felt nothing when the sentence was read. No satisfaction, no vindication, just exhaustion. Brandon was let out in handcuffs, and I gathered my things and left the courthouse. Harrison was with my mom. I picked him up and drove home, fed him dinner, gave him a bath, read him 3 board books about farm animals. The mundane normalcy of it felt like the only real thing in my life. Melissa reached out again a few weeks later, asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something made me agree. We met at a cafe near my apartment on a Saturday morning. She looked different than she had in Francine's office. Less polished, but more genuine. She'd cut her hair short and wore minimal makeup. We sat awkwardly for a few minutes before she spoke. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I know I'm not the villain in this, but I still feel responsible somehow. Like if I'd questioned things more, dug deeper earlier, maybe I could have stopped him before he hurt you worse." "You didn't know," I said. "Neither of us did. He's good at lying." She nodded, stared into her coffee. "I lost my job because of this. Small firm, couldn't handle the scandal. My parents stopped speaking to me because they think I knowingly dated a married man. I had to move back in with my sister. We talked for 2 hours, compared notes on Brandon's patterns, the ways he'd manipulated us both. She'd loaned him $12,000 last year when he claimed he needed to help his supposedly divorced ex-wife with medical bills for their son, my medical bills. He'd pocketed the money for God knows what. By the end of that conversation, something unexpected happened. We'd formed a strange kind of alliance. 2 women who'd loved the same liar, who'd built futures on his false promises. We exchanged numbers, started texting occasionally. She sent Harrison a Christmas gift, a stuffed elephant that became his favorite toy. The restitution money came in pieces over the next year. Brandon's assets were liquidated to pay what he owed. The house in Austin was sold. His car, his collections of expensive watches and golf clubs. Everything was auctioned off and the proceeds split between restitution to me and his other debts. I put every dollar into a college fund for Harrison. I didn't visit Brandon in prison, didn't write, didn't respond to the letters he sent through his attorney asking to see photos of Harrison, asking me to consider reconciliation after his release. Francine handled all communication, her responses brief and professional. "My client is not interested in contact at this time." Harrison turned 1 year old on a Tuesday in April. We had a small party at my apartment. My parents, my brother and his wife, my college roommate who'd driven 3 hours to be there. Melissa came too, bringing a homemade cake and a card that made me cry. Harrison smashed his face into the frosting and laughed, completely oblivious to everything that had happened to bring him to this moment. I took a photo of him covered in blue icing, his hands reaching for more. In that picture, he looks purely joyful. No trauma, no absent father, just a baby experiencing sugar for the first time. I printed it and put it in a frame on my dresser, a reminder that despite everything, something good had come from my marriage to Brandon. Work expanded over the following months. My boss promoted me to senior account manager, doubled my salary, offered to convert my position to part-time in office if I wanted more structure. I accepted, found a daycare near the office that Harrison loved. Slowly, methodically, I rebuilt a life. Brandon got released on parole after serving 18 months. I found out through Francine, who'd been monitoring his case. He was required to wear an ankle monitor and couldn't leave the state. The restraining order was still in effect, meaning he couldn't contact me directly or come near our home. He tried anyway. 3 weeks after his release, I was at the grocery store with Harrison when I spotted him 2 aisles over. He was thinner, his hair longer, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right. Our eyes met across the produce section. He started walking toward us. I grabbed Harrison and walked directly to the store manager's office. Called the police from there. Brandon was arrested for violating the restraining order before he even made it out of the parking lot. His parole was revoked, and he was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence. That was the last time I saw him in person. The last time he tried to force contact. After that, silence. Months passed with no letters, no attempted communication through intermediaries. It was like he'd finally accepted that this chapter was closed, that there was no rewriting history or earning forgiveness. Harrison started walking at 13 months. His first word was mama, which felt like a small victory. He was a happy kid, easygoing and curious about everything. People would comment on how content he seemed, how rarely he cried or fussed. I wondered sometimes if children could sense when the chaos around them had finally settled, when the adults had stopped radiating anxiety and fear. I started dating again when Harrison was 18 months old. Nothing serious at first, just coffee with a man named Keith I'd met through work. He was divorced with a daughter Harrison's age. We went on 6 dates before I told him everything about Brandon. He listened without judgment, then said something I didn't expect. "Thank you for trusting me with that. It can't have been easy to share." We dated for 8 months before I broke it off. He was kind, stable, everything Brandon wasn't. But I realized I was dating him because he was safe, not because I actually loved him. That seemed unfair to both of us. We ended things amicably, and I took a long break from trying to find someone new. Melissa got engaged to someone she met through her sister, a teacher named Felix who seemed genuinely decent. She invited me to the wedding, and I went, bringing Harrison, who charmed everyone by stealing cookies from the dessert table. Watching her get married felt surreal, like we'd both survived something catastrophic and emerged on the other side fundamentally changed. Brandon finished his sentence when Harrison was 2.5. This time he didn't try to contact us. Francine heard through legal channels that he'd moved to Nevada, was working construction under a supervisor who specialized in hiring ex-convicts. Apparently he was going to therapy mandated by his parole terms and staying out of trouble. I found that I didn't care. He'd become irrelevant to my life, A cautionary tale I might tell Harrison someday when he was old enough to understand. But for now, Harrison knew nothing about his father. To him, family meant grandma and grandpa, Uncle Nathan and Aunt Bridget, occasional visits from Auntie Melissa, who always brought the best presents. My career continued growing. I was managing major campaigns by the time Harrison turned 3, making enough money to move us into a small house with a yard. Harrison got a swing set and a sandbox. We adopted a rescue dog named Biscuit, who slept at the foot of his bed every night. Life became ordinary in the best possible way. Preschool drop-offs and pickup routines, playground visits and children's museum memberships, birthday parties with too much sugar and goodie bags. Harrison made friends easily, was kind to other kids, loved books about dinosaurs and trucks. None of his preschool teachers ever questioned why there was no father in the picture. Single parents were common enough that it didn't warrant comment. Brandon's name came up one last time when Harrison was 4. His parole officer contacted Francine asking if I'd be willing to sign off on Brandon terminating his parental rights voluntarily. He wanted a clean break, wanted to move forward without the legal obligation of fatherhood. Part of his therapy, apparently, was accepting he couldn't undo his past mistakes, but could prevent future harm by removing himself entirely from Harrison's life. Francine asked what I wanted to do. I thought about it for 3 days. Discussed it with my parents, with Melissa, even with my therapist I'd been seeing monthly since the trial. Everyone had opinions, but ultimately the decision was mine. I signed the papers, let Brandon terminate his rights. It meant Harrison would never have to deal with court-mandated visitation or the confusion of a father who appeared sporadically. It meant I could make decisions about Harrison's life without needing approval from someone who'd never been present anyway. Most importantly, it meant Brandon acknowledged he'd forfeited his chance at being a father through his own choices. The judge approved the termination without contest. Brandon was legally no longer Harrison's father. That night I sat in Harrison's room watching him sleep, this perfect little person who'd been born into chaos, but somehow remained untouched by it. He still had my last name, still had grandparents who adored him, and a mother who'd walk through fire for him. The absence of Brandon didn't leave a hole because he'd never really been there to begin with. Harrison started kindergarten that fall. His teacher was a woman named Ms. Rodriguez who sent home weekly newsletters and organized elaborate class projects. At parent-teacher conferences, she told me Harrison was thriving, that he was empathetic and creative and loved helping other kids. She didn't mention fathers or two-parent households. She talked about Harrison as his own complete person, which felt exactly right. I met someone new when Harrison was 5. His name was Gabriel, and he managed the coffee shop near my office where I'd been getting my morning latte for 2 years. We'd exchanged small talk dozens of times before he finally asked if I'd like to have coffee somewhere other than his shop. I said yes without overthinking it. Gabriel was nothing like Brandon. He was quiet where Brandon had been loud, thoughtful where Brandon had been impulsive. He worked as a barista by choice, not necessity, because he loved the craft of coffee and the community his shop created. He wrote poetry in his spare time and volunteered teaching literacy to adults. We dated for 4 months before I introduced him to Harrison. Even then, I framed it carefully. This is my friend Gabriel. We're going to go to the park together. Harrison, at 5, accepted this without question. He liked Gabriel immediately because Gabriel knew how to build elaborate sand castles and didn't mind getting dirty. The relationship developed slowly. Gabriel never pushed for more access or faster commitment. He seemed content to exist in whatever space I was comfortable giving him. We'd have dinner together once a week. He'd come to Harrison's soccer games sometimes, sitting with my parents in the stands. He met Melissa at Harrison's 6th birthday party, and they talked for an hour about teaching methods and educational philosophy. A year into our relationship, Gabriel asked if he could take Harrison to the Science Museum for a special robotics exhibit. Just the two of them, giving me a Saturday to myself. I hesitated, not because I didn't trust Gabriel, but because letting someone else take care of Harrison felt like relinquishing control I'd held tightly since his birth. But I said yes. Watched them drive away together, Harrison chattering excitedly about robots. Spent 6 hours barely able to focus on anything else until they returned sunburned and exhausted. Harrison talking a mile a minute about everything he'd seen and done. Gabriel had documented the whole day in photos, making sure I didn't miss any moments. That night, after Harrison was asleep, I cried. Not from sadness, but from the realization that I'd found someone genuinely good. Someone who saw Harrison as important, not because it was obligatory, but because he'd chosen to care. Someone who understood that earning a place in our lives was a privilege, not a right. Gabriel and I moved in together when Harrison was 7. We bought a house big enough for all of us, with a room for Harrison and a home office where I could work and Gabriel could write. Biscuit the dog adjusted immediately, claiming Gabriel's reading chair as his new favorite spot. Harrison seemed happy about the arrangement, especially when Gabriel built him a treehouse in the backyard. We didn't get married. Neither of us felt the need for a legal ceremony to validate what we'd built, but we were partners in every way that mattered. We made decisions together about Harrison's schooling and healthcare. We alternated cooking dinner and doing dishes. We showed up for each other's bad days without being asked. Brandon's name stopped coming up entirely. He'd become a footnote in my history, relevant only in explaining to doctors why certain genetic information was unavailable. Harrison never asked about his biological father. When kids at school talked about their dads, Harrison talked about Gabriel, who came to school events and helped with homework and taught him to ride a bike. On Harrison's 8th birthday, Gabriel asked if he could adopt Harrison legally. make their relationship official in a way that mattered for things like emergency contacts and school paperwork. I was surprised by how emotional the question made me, not because I doubted Gabriel's commitment, but because it represented healing I hadn't known was possible. I asked Harrison what he thought. He looked confused. "Isn't Gabriel already my dad?" he asked. "He does all the dad things." We explained the difference, that Gabriel wasn't his biological father but wanted to be his legal father. Harrison considered this for maybe 10 seconds before shrugging. "Okay," he said. "Can we have cake now?" The adoption process was straightforward since Brandon had already terminated his parental rights years earlier. A judge reviewed our petition, asked Harrison a few age-appropriate questions about whether he wanted Gabriel to be his father, and signed the papers. Gabriel cried in the courthouse, which made me cry, which made Harrison announce that everyone was being weird, but he was happy anyway. Life continued its ordinary rhythms. Harrison joined the swim team and discovered he was naturally good at freestyle. Gabriel got a story published in a literary magazine, his first real success after years of rejections. My career plateaued at a level I was comfortable with, senior enough to have influence, but not so senior that I had to sacrifice time with my family. We took Harrison to Disney World for his 9th birthday. The three of us plus my parents, who'd never stopped being actively involved in Harrison's life. Watching Harrison experience the parks was pure joy. He was old enough to appreciate everything, but young enough to still believe in magic. Gabriel knew all the best spots to avoid crowds and which rides had the shortest wait times. My dad got sunburned taking Harrison on every roller coaster multiple times. On our last night, we watched the fireworks from in front of the castle. Harrison sat on Gabriel's shoulders, both of them pointing out different colors and patterns. My mom squeezed my hand and whispered that she was proud of how I'd rebuilt our lives after everything fell apart, that Harrison was lucky to have the family we'd created. I thought about Brandon briefly, for the first time in months. Wondered if he ever thought about the son he'd abandoned, if he felt regret or relief at having escaped fatherhood. Then I let the thought go. He didn't matter anymore. He was a mistake I'd made at 24. A painful chapter that had somehow led to all the good things in my current life. Harrison started middle school at 11, entering that awkward phase where childhood and adolescence collide. He got braces and grew 4 inches in 6 months and started caring about what clothes he wore. Gabriel helped him navigate the social complexities while I handled the emotional volatility that came with hormones and increased independence. The Brandon situation finally reached its absolute conclusion when Harrison was 12. Francine called me on a Tuesday afternoon to inform me that Brandon had died in a construction accident in Nevada, fell from scaffolding at a job site. He'd been 41 years old. I felt strange hearing the news. Not grief exactly, but a weird sense of finality. The possibility of Brandon ever disrupting our lives again had always existed in some background corner of my mind. Now that possibility was gone. He died alone according to the accident report. No spouse or children listed in his paperwork. Just an emergency contact who was his landlord. I told Harrison that evening. Kept it factual and unemotional. The man who was your biological father died in an accident. I wanted you to know, but this doesn't change anything about our family. Harrison processed this silently for a few minutes, then asked if he needed to feel sad. No, I said. You don't need to feel anything you don't actually feel. He nodded and went back to his homework. That night, Gabriel found me sitting alone in our bedroom, staring at nothing. You okay? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. I thought I'd feel something more definitive. Relief, or anger, or closure, but I just feel tired. He sat beside me. You've been carrying this for 12 years, he said. The betrayal, the fear he'd show up again, the worry about how to explain everything to Harrison someday. Maybe tiredness is what closure feels like for you. We held a small ceremony of sorts, just the three of us. Went to the beach and wrote Brandon's name in the sand. Let the tide wash it away. Harrison's idea, surprisingly. He said he'd seen it in a movie and thought it seemed like a good way to say goodbye to someone you didn't really know. We stood there watching the waves erase the letters, and then we went home and had tacos for dinner. Life moved forward. Harrison excelled at swimming, made junior varsity as an 8th grader. Gabriel's second book of poetry got accepted by a small press. I got promoted to director of marketing, overseeing a team of 12 people. We renovated the kitchen and adopted a second rescue dog that Harrison named Professor Barksworth. Harrison asked me about Brandon only once more, when he was 13 and going through his baby photos for a school project. There aren't any pictures of my bio dad, he observed. I looked at him carefully. Do you want there to be? I asked. He shook his head. No, I was just noticing. Gabriel's in most of them anyway, even from when I was really little. I realized he was right. Gabriel had been present for so many moments. Harrison's 4th birthday, his first day of kindergarten, his first swim meet. He'd inserted himself into our story so gradually and naturally that it was hard to remember a time before him. At Harrison's 8th grade graduation, Gabriel gave a speech as one of the parent volunteers. Talked about watching these kids grow and change, about the privilege of bearing witness to their becoming. Harrison beamed from his seat in the auditorium. Later, when we were taking photos, he pulled Gabriel aside and hugged him hard. Thanks for being my dad, he said simply. Gabriel's eyes got wet, but he just hugged back and said there was nowhere else he'd rather be. That summer, we took a road trip across the country. Just the three of us and both dogs crammed into our SUV. Visited national parks and quirky roadside attractions. Harrison complained about the long drives, but loved every destination. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of rambling conversations families have when trapped in a car together for hours. Somewhere in Utah, Harrison asked about my childhood. what my parents were like, what I'd been like as a kid. I told him stories about my brother and me fighting over the TV remote, about my mom's terrible cooking experiments, about my dad teaching me to change a tire. Normal stories from a normal childhood. Then he asked what his other grandparents were like, Brandon's parents. I paused, trying to figure out how honest to be. They made choices that hurt people, I said finally. They knew about things they should have stopped and didn't. Sometimes being family isn't enough if people don't act with integrity. Harrison absorbed this. Am I like him? He asked quietly. Brandon? I looked at him in the rearview mirror. His face was so earnest, genuinely worried that he carried some genetic predisposition toward cruelty. No, I said firmly. You're kind and honest, and you think about how your actions affect other people. That's not genetics. That's who you've chosen to be. Gabriel reached over and squeezed my hand. Harrison seemed satisfied with the answer and went back to reading his book. But I thought about that question for the rest of the drive, about nature versus nurture, about whether Brandon had been born broken or had become that way through choices, about how I'd somehow raised a child free from his father's worst traits despite sharing DNA. High school started and Harrison joined every club and activity imaginable. Swimming year-round, debate team, volunteer tutoring at the elementary school. He had his father's energy but channeled it into productive places. Gabriel and I attended endless events, cheering from bleachers and auditorium seats, documenting everything with photos and videos. Harrison brought home his first girlfriend when he was 15, a girl named Stephanie who was on the debate team with him. She was smart and funny and didn't take any of his nonsense. They'd sit at our kitchen table working on cases for hours, arguing passionately about policy proposals. Gabriel would make them snacks and pretend not to eavesdrop on their conversations. The relationship lasted 8 months before they mutually decided they were better as friends. Harrison was philosophical about it. We want different things, he explained. She's moving to the East Coast for college and I'm staying here. No point pretending that'll work. I was impressed by his emotional maturity, his ability to make difficult decisions with grace. College applications consumed Harrison's junior year. He wanted to study marine biology, had fallen in love with the ocean during our family trips to the coast. We visited campuses up and down California, evaluating programs and facilities. Harrison asked thoughtful questions about research opportunities and study abroad programs. He got accepted to UCSD with a partial scholarship. We threw a party to celebrate, inviting everyone who'd been part of Harrison's journey. My parents, my brother's family, Melissa and her husband Felix, who now had 2 kids of their own, Harrison's friends and teammates and teachers, Gabriel's parents who'd embraced their grandson role without question. At the party, my mom pulled me aside. Do you remember when you showed up at our house with Harrison, completely shattered, thinking your life was over? She asked. Look at what you built from those pieces. Look at that young man over there. You did that. I watched Harrison laughing with his friends, confident and whole. You and Dad helped, I said. I couldn't have done this alone. Maybe not, she agreed. But you made the hard choices. You protected him and yourself. You built something better than what you lost. The summer before Harrison left for college was bittersweet. He worked as a lifeguard at the community pool and spent his evenings with friends, savoring the last months before everyone scattered to different schools. Gabriel and I tried not to be too obviously sad about the approaching empty nest, but we definitely lingered in doorways watching Harrison exist in our house, memorizing the everyday moments we'd soon miss. Move-in day at UCSD was chaotic. Boxes and storage bins and bags stuffed into a tiny dorm room. Harrison's roommate was from Oregon and seemed equally overwhelmed. Gabriel helped assemble furniture while I organized the closet and pretended I wasn't about to cry. When it was time to leave, Harrison hugged us both hard. Thank you for everything, he said. I know I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful every day for the life you gave me. The drive home was quiet. Gabriel and I held hands across the center console, both lost in our own thoughts. The house felt too big and too empty. Biscuit and Professor Barksworth wandered around looking for Harrison, confused by his absence. But life adjusted, as it always does. Harrison video called twice a week, updating us on classes and friends and his work at the campus marine lab. He was thriving, exactly as he should be. Gabriel and I rediscovered what it meant to be just the two of us. We took a trip to Portland, spent weekends hiking, started going to concerts again. Harrison came home for winter break different somehow. More independent, more certain of himself. He declared his major officially and joined a research team studying kelp forest ecosystems. He told us about his professors and his projects with genuine excitement, the kind that came from finding your purpose. On Christmas Eve, just the 3 of us in our living room, Harrison said he'd been thinking about his origin story, about how I'd left Brandon and rebuilt everything alone, about how Gabriel had shown up and chosen fatherhood, about Melissa becoming family through shared trauma, about grandparents who'd given everything to help us survive. Most people get one family, he said. I got this whole assembled collection of people who chose each other. That's better than normal. That's special. Gabriel and I both cried. Harrison laughed and said we were being embarrassing, but he was smiling too. We stayed up late talking about everything and nothing, the way families do when they're together and safe and whole. Years passed. Harrison graduated with honors, got accepted to graduate school for marine biology. He had serious relationships and heartbreaks and adventures. He traveled for research, sending photos from boats and beaches around the world. He grew into someone thoughtful and passionate and kind. Gabriel and I aged alongside our chosen life. More gray hair, reading glasses, joints that protested morning runs. But we were happy in a deep, settled way. We'd built something that lasted, that meant something. Brandon became ancient history. A name Harrison might mention clinically in medical forms, but nothing more. His absence had stopped being a wound and become simply a fact, something that shaped our story but didn't define it. When Harrison was 26, he brought home a woman named Iris he'd met during a research expedition. She studied coral reefs and had sun-bleached hair and laughed at all his terrible jokes. They were clearly in love, that new giddy kind that made you believe the world was brighter than it actually was. We had dinner together, the four of us. Iris asked about how Gabriel and I met, how long we'd been together. Harrison told the story, including the parts about me being a single mom, and Gabriel proving himself slowly over time. Iris listened with interest, then said something that stuck with me. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose. Biology is just random chance. Commitment is what matters. I thought about Brandon one last time, about the man who'd missed Harrison's birth for golf, who'd married another woman while I was pregnant, who'd built elaborate lies and stolen money and abandoned his child, who'd died alone with no one to mourn him. And then I looked at Gabriel, who'd stayed, who'd shown up for every swim meet and parent-teacher conference, who'd taught Harrison to drive and helped him through calculus, and loved him not because he had to, but because he'd chosen to, who'd taken a traumatized woman and her baby, and said, yes, this is my family, let me prove it to you every single day. That was fatherhood. That was family. Not the DNA or the legal documents, but the accumulation of small daily choices to love someone, and show up and keep showing up, even when it was hard. Brandon had given Harrison life, but Gabriel had given him everything else. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.